Good evening, and welcome to the Kelvin Lecture of the 224th session of the Royal Philosophical Society of Glasgow. If you have a mobile phone on you, please turn it off or turn it to silence so that it doesn't go off during the lecture. The Society's former president, Lord Kelvin, was actively engaged in research into electric and magnetic fields, and his research in this area provided the foundation for James Clerk Maxwell to develop the theory of electromagnetism. I'm sure he would have been very interested indeed to be at tonight's lecture. Barbara Maher is Professor Emerita at the University of Lancaster, where she is Director of the Centre for Environmental Magnetism and Palaeomagnetism. Her research publications have been cited by over 8,000 other research works. Professor Maher has produced numerous prestigious awards and distinctions. She's an elected Fellow of the Royal Society, has been the Edward Bullard Lecturer of the American Geophysical Union, of which she is also a Fellow, received the Schlumberger Award from the Mineralogical Society of Great Britain and Ireland, and is a recipient of the Pilkington Teaching Award. I'm certain we'll all learn much from her tonight, as she speaks to us on the topic of magnetism and the brain, pollution, particles, and Alzheimer's disease. Professor Maher.
So good evening, everybody. It really is a pleasure and a privilege to be here to tell you about some of my magnetic research. Many thanks indeed to Pat, the President, for this invitation. Very much appreciated. I'd also just take a moment before the start of the lecture proper just to acknowledge scientific work is not driven purely by individuals. There's always enormous help and cooperation from contributing colleagues. So I'd like to take the moment just to acknowledge the inputs from some of my trusted and incisive colleagues. Okay, I'm going to talk to you this evening about magnetic particles. And I spent my entire scientific career looking at magnetic particles. And you might say, how have you lived all your lives without thinking about magnetic particles? Now, the thing is, and I hope to prove this to you shortly, there are magnetic minerals, there are magnetic particles everywhere in the environment. And those magnetic particles form an absolute rich resource of magnetic recordings, magnetic information, which allows us to address big questions, fundamental scientific questions about both past and present changes in both the natural environment and indeed in our human-built environment. The way these magnetic particles form, the way they are transported through the environment, where they deposit, and you'll be surprised where they deposit when I get into the main bit of this talk, how they transform from one mineral to a different mineral, all of those processes carry information. And those processes take place across every length scale, from the global, literally, to the nanoscale. Now, the mineral that's my favorite is magnetite. There's a clue in the name, isn't there? It's the most magnetic of the family of iron oxides. As I will demonstrate to you, it's both abundant and widespread. And it occurs in a very broad range of particle sizes. And of course, no matter what context, size matters. Now, to give you a bit of a sort of insight into that range of particle sizes, I've borrowed this slide. It's a fantastic slide. I couldn't have produced anything more beautiful myself. So this ridiculous thing that looks like a lizard's tail, that's a human hair at the side of the slide. And then we're going to come down in particle size. So we've got the human hair, which is somewhere between 50 and 180 micrometers. A micrometer is 1,000th of a millimeter, okay? And then we come down to a particle, say, of beach sand that, you know, stuck between your toes, about 90 micrometers. We come down to a grain of salt, about 60 micrometers. We come down to a white blood cell, 25 micrometers. And then you can see if we follow down, we come to dust particles, 10 micrometers. red blood cells, about 7 to 8 micrometers, and we carry on all the way down to the bottom of this, bottom left-hand corner of the slide. We get down to things like viruses, bacteria. These are not even micrometer scale, these are nanoparticulate scale, less than 100 nanometers. So when I talk about magnetic nanoparticles, we're right down at the bottom of this illustration of particle sizes. When I talk about large magnetic particles, my large particles are about 5 micrometers, okay, about the size of a red blood cell. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a micrograph, an electron microscope image of what I would call large magnetic particles. And these are particles that were blown about in dust over the deserts of China. So they were derived from rock weathering. And you can see on the right-hand side what a beautiful crystalline shape this magnetic particle is forming. So these are large, relatively speaking, rock-derived magnetite particles. And you can see the lovely geometric shapes. They're very crystalline shapes shown in these pictures. And there's the scale bar that shows you this particle that I'm showing you now is about 5 micrometers in size. So that particle, if we were to plot it on this diagram, you could see it would be just between the red blood cell size and then another particle of dust, PM2.5. PM, not Prime Minister, particulate matter, 2.5 micrometers. So that lovely rock-derived magnetite would slot between the red blood cell and the PM2.5. Okay, let me show you some more beautiful magnetic particles. So these magnetic particles, top left, these are forming in situ in the roots of mangrove swamps. And you can see they're lovely magnetic. They've got all those other little bits sticking to them magnetically. Beautiful crystalline magnetic particles. Certain types of soil make magnetite. They're very good at making magnetite. We get really strongly magnetic soils. Those particles, look at the scale bar now, we're down to 0.1 of a micrometer. And they're forming in soil, so this is at sort of, surface temperatures, Earth surface temperatures, not really hot temperatures. They're forming at temperatures ambient at the Earth's surface. More magnetic particles, these ones are superb. These are made inside bacteria that actually build those magnetic particles inside their cells. Why? So they can feel the Earth's magnetic field and they can swim following the lines of magnetic field. These are called magnetotactic bacteria. Now, I'm going to show you, hopefully I'm going to show you this video. We did wonder if it would be troublesome. Here we go. This is a very old video, so that's why it was a bit hesitant in playing. I'm going to show you some of these magnetotactic bacteria under a light microscope. So here they are. These were magnetic bacteria that were separated from the sediments at the bottom of a pond. And what's happening here is they're on a microscope slide in a bead of water, and we're applying a magnetic field to the left. So not all of these bacteria are magnetic, but those that are feel the Earth's magnetic field lines and they're swimming across. Oh, and now we've switched it. And they're swimming. Oh, and we've switched it. It's sad, isn't it? Can you see the one that's reversely magnetized compared to everybody else? Now, if we actually look at the trajectory of travel of these bacteria, they're using their tail to project themselves. As soon as they start to swim, they feel the torque of the magnetic field lines. I guess you could say if you were a magnetotactic bacterium, you'd say life's a bit of a drag. Now then, here, you can actually see the magnetic crystals inside the cells. So we've got a magnet that's right at the corner of the bead of water. And see that bacterium, it's going to split into two. And you can see its magnetite crystals, its chain of magnetite crystals. What they're going to do when the bacterium splits into is the chain is going to split into two, and each bacterial cell will have the chain of magnetite inside them. So just keep an eye on it. That's it, it's splitting. Now then, we're now playing a rotating magnetic field. And you can see these magnetic bacteria faithfully following. This is a very serious magnetic experiment. We're going to increase the speed. And we're going to keep on increasing it until the bugs can no longer follow. So then we identify the max magnetic torque they can respond to. Enough already. Okay, let's go back to our magnetic particles atlas. So here, this is a high temperature magnetite. This one is a micrometeorite. So these strongly ion-rich particles from outer space, bits of asteroid, bits of meteorite, they come as space dust, and these have been able to survive the hot temperatures as they penetrate the Earth's atmosphere and fall onto the surface of the Earth. So this is a magnetic micrometeorite. Look at the scale bar. There will be a test at the end if you paid attention to the scale bars. This is about 20 micrometers across. So this is a large magnetic particle, relatively speaking. So high temperature magnetites, they're often this spherical shape because they're actually molten droplets when they formed. And then as they've cooled, they've kept that droplet shape. Now we're going to come to the meat of the matter. We're going to come to these magnetic particles that are going to be the focus of the attention of the rest of the talk. Micrometeorites form by getting heated as they fall through the Earth's atmosphere. These particles that I'm showing you now, these are, if you like, anthropogenic high-temperature magnetic particles. They were formed by fossil fuels being burnt, and the iron impurity in the fossil fuel formed a residue. It was a molten droplet as it came out of a chimney or came out of a vehicle exhaust. It kept its spherical shape. And you can see on the surface of these magnetic spherules, these round particles, can you see there are interlocking crystallites, little crystals that are interlocking with each other? That's as the particle was cooling, and different parts of it cooled slightly ahead of the other, so there are little interlocking crystallites on the surface. And if you look closely at that picture, now you can see the scale bar, 2 micrometers. So there's quite a large magnetic spherule, but look closely. Can you see lots of other much, much smaller spherules also in that picture? This is a picture of a roadside soil. And all of those spheres are magnetic particles derived from the vehicles that have been going past this particular location. Now, quite a lot of those particles, they're sort of 5 or 10 micrometers in size, but these particles occur even in sizes down to 5 or 10 nanometers in size. So the particles that I'm showing you on the right-hand side are magnetic particles that were collected by pumping an Earth sample onto a filter outside Lancaster bus station. Not a great place to spend a lot of time, I warn you. So can you see the spherical particles, and can you see the scale bars now that we're using are down to that nanometer scale? And these particles, again, these are diesel exhaust particles. Okay. Now, not every air pollution particle, not every magnetic air pollution particle is spherical, because those that come out from the exhaust have been heated, but there are lots of other particles that come from vehicles, including brake wear, tire wear, road dust. So there are lots of different sizes and shapes of magnetic particles that come out of vehicles in particular, but other industry sources as well. Okay, so some of our magnetic air pollution particles, they form at these high temperatures as these iron-rich droplets, and they condense and cool as they get released into the atmosphere. When we look at those particles in more detail, and I'll show you some data in a moment, many of those magnetic particles also coexist with other metals, lots of other metals, chromium, nickel, molybdenum, platinum, etc. So, and they're coming from the same source. They're coming from exhausts, they're coming from the brake wear. So iron is a very common constituent, but there are also these other metals present as well. So all of our vehicles are a tremendously good source of nanoscale magnetic particulates. when we look at industry emissions, things like power stations, iron and steel industry, of course, they are tremendously efficient at pumping out large amounts of these strongly magnetic particles into the atmosphere. Now, in Lancaster, one of the things that I got involved in quite early on was the idea that some of the medics in Lancaster were bemoaning the fact to me that they wanted to look at the effects of air pollution on human health. So as medics, they had lots of human health data, right down to postcode level, and they wanted to compare the spatial distribution of ill health with the spatial distribution of air pollution to see was there a causal connection. And in Lancaster, at that time, we had one air pollution monitoring station outside Sainsbury's supermarket, quite close to the bus station. So if you only have data from one place, you cannot work out what the exposure is for different people and therefore what links there might be between health and air pollution. So we had this idea that around Lancaster, it's a lovely green city. There are lots of roadside trees. And the leaves of those trees, basically, they're acting as little passive collection filters for air pollution. And so that's what you're looking at here. You see the ribbed surface of a birch leaf, and it's covered in air pollution particles. And if you look closely, you'll see there's lots of different sizes and shapes. The width of this micrograph is about 25 micrometers. So again, lots of different sizes of these particles. And again, if you get your eye in, and to help you get your eye in, here's a little helpful star. Watch now, here it comes. Can you see some of these are spherules, very circular particles? Not all of them, but some of them. So this is typical. The roadside leaves are collecting exhaust particles, and they're collecting breakware particles, road dust, etc. Here's a picture of some of the breakware particles. And again, very strongly magnetic. And what we've shown you here on the bottom left is the co-association of our iron-rich material with these other metals. So you can see there's a colourful map here. So copper, for example, is shown in the blue colour. Iron is the yellow colour. Chromium and titanium are present as well. So breakware particles, especially in non-electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are a different kettle of fish, actually, because mostly they use regenerative braking. So there's a lot less breakwear from electrical vehicles. But ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles, a lot of particles are released by breakwear. Now, quite clearly, not all air pollution particles are magnetic particles, but if you look at these data, there's a very strong correlation between the amount of magnetic particles and the total amount of particulate pollution. So each of these diagrams, the top left, this is measuring, again, a pumped air sample on a filter, and we're measuring the total magnetic content of that filter on the y-axis against the mass of particles, which is what people conventionally measure for air pollution, is the mass of particles. And you can see as the filter magnetism goes up, the mass of particles goes up. Very, very strong linear correlation. On the top right-hand side, these are data from Italy, from some colleagues in Italy. And you can see the magnetism, again, is the measurement on the y-axis. And in this case, what they're measuring is nitrous oxides, these gases that are released by vehicles particularly. And again, you see such a strong relationship because all of these things, they're being produced at the same source, in this case, the traffic pollution. And the bottom diagram is measuring the leaves, how magnetic the roadside leaves are. So that's on the y-axis again, compared to the PM10 concentration, particulate matter, 10 microns and less, the concentration in micrograms per cubic meter of air. So you can see, can't you, that the magnetism, the magnetic content is a really good correlate with the total conventional measures of air pollution. Airborne particulate matter. Why on earth do I have this picture? It's a cocktail, a veritable cocktail a mixture of all sorts of compounds and elements. So you've got a lot of carbon-rich aerosols, and then you've got the inorganic primary and secondary components. So whenever we're walking around our city or driving around our city or on a bus in our city, you're going to be breathing in urban particulate matter, really enriched in metals. You can almost smell it, can't you? You can smell the fumes. So you've got all sorts of metals in there. I've got a list of them here. And as well as all those metals, you'll always have some of this strongly magnetic particulate matter. I've mentioned these sources already, coming out the exhaust pipe. Tires are not just rubber, lots of metals in tires. Road dust, industry emissions, etc. So somewhere around 10% of solid particulate matter in the air that we're breathing consists of these iron-rich, strongly magnetic nanoparticles. Nanoparticle less than 100 nanometers in diameter. Okay, here comes the bad news. Exposure to particulate matter is known to be really bad for your health. And this has been known for a long time. So statistically, people look at amount of particulate matter in the air compared to human health outcomes. And statistically, there are strong associations between more air pollution and more disease. And that's true, it's been known for a long time. Lung cancer, for example, cardiovascular disease, low birth weight, all of those poor health outcomes strongly related statistically to the amount of particulate matter in the air that we're breathing. But as I mentioned, spatially, over a city, it's very hard to get a map of different amounts of particulate matter because there are very few monitoring stations spread out across cities. So we beat that difficulty. We produced a leaf magnetic map of Lancaster. So the bigger the circle, the greater amount of leaf magnetism, i.e. the greater amount of traffic-derived particulate pollution on those roadside leaves. So you can see the side streets, very small amounts of particulate pollution. And then you can see particular areas of the city. So I should have a mouse. Hang on, let's just see if we get this to work. Can you see? Oh, no. Go back. Can you see that group of 4? Let me just point out here. See that group of 4 big circles, and then it's just 2 little dots just to the south of it? That's a school. That's a school run. And all of the parking near to the school, all the parents dropping the kids off for safety, they're poisoning the children. So you can see now a spatial representation. So our leaf magnetic map of Lancaster equals a map of airborne particulate matter. Iron and the brain, part 1. Now, when I was doing this work on the leaf magnetism and the particulate pollution and identifying the sizes of particles and the numbers of particles, I read a lot. And I was reading in Alzheimer's disease brains, the iron concentration in those brains in certain regions is much higher than in normal brain tissue. It's about 3 times higher in certain regions of Alzheimer's brains. And then I read a paper that came out in 2014 by some people in London that said the concentration of strongly magnetic magnetite was higher in AD brain tissues. When I looked at the paper, the results, certainly that's what it showed, but actually there was only 6 brain samples that were analysed in the paper. So you can see samples A, B, and C here have much greater amounts of magnetic material, magnetite basically, in their brains compared to the 3 control samples, the non-Alzheimer's samples, but it's very few samples. Now, the thing about iron in the brain is iron is an essential element. The brain needs it particularly. But if it's not safely stored, if it's not safely transported, if it's not safely regulated in the brain, It's toxic, it's poisonous to the brain. And the reason for that is because a particular form of iron, ferrous iron, Fe2+, it catalyzes production of these damaging reactive oxygen species that cause oxidative stress, that cause cell damage, and if that excess oxidative stress continues, eventually they cause death of brain cells. And if you remember, when we look at airborne particulate matter, iron-bearing particles are often the most abundant in that cocktail of different particles that we've analysed. So when I read all this material and put all that together, I thought, just what if some of that excess iron is coming from the air pollution? And that was a very controversial thing to even be thinking, because up till that moment, everybody thought that all magnetite in the brain and all iron in the brain was formed inside the brain, that it was of biogenic origin. So for somebody to start saying, well, actually, maybe some of this iron is coming from outside, from air pollution exposure, was a very controversial thing to say. Now, let me just tell you first about the natural magnetite, the biogenic magnetite that is present in human brains. Many, many years ago, a colleague of mine from California, Joe Kirschvink, he published a paper and he said, there is natural magnetite in human brains. And this is a picture of Joe. And Joe has done a lot of work demonstrating that certain people have enough natural magnetite in their brains that they can navigate by it. I have to tell you, I'm not one of those people. I get lost very easily. So what does the natural brain magnetite look like? Here are some photographs of what the natural brain magnetite looks like. It's those lovely crystal shapes. You see, very geometric. Because they've precipitated in situ in the brain, they've grown and they've developed into a lovely, fully magnetite crystal structure. So that's what these biogenic brain magnetites look like. Now, brain magnetite is not uncommon at all across the animal kingdom. You've seen the bacteria, our magnetic bacteria, so they make tons of the stuff. But birds make magnetites, pigeons in particular make, bees make magnetite, dolphins, salmon, I could go on. It's a very common trait in the natural kingdoms that you know, there's an ability to make navigational magnetite. Proving that humans have a magnetic navigation sense has actually been quite controversial as well. But anyway, it is thought that just like the bacteria use it, some humans are able to have a magnetic navigation sense. The other possibility that's been proposed is it's a safe, dense way of storing iron, because you remember I told you it's toxic if it's not safely stored. So brain magnetite like this might be a way of storing in a safe way iron in the brain. So we'd been measuring the leaves. I'd been looking at the magnetite and looking at its size and the number of particles at the roadside. We know that iron is higher in Alzheimer's brains than normal brains. And then there was another paper produced that suggested magnetite particles were actually inside Alzheimer's disease plaques. So inside those clusters of defect tissue, these Alzheimer's plaques, magnetite particles were found right inside them. So this is a photograph of what an Alzheimer's brain looks like. So amongst the normal cells and tissues of the brain, you get these agglomerations of dead cells and protein, amyloid protein, called plaques. And then also you can get to what's known as these neurofibrillary tangles. So both plaques and tangles are known to be sites of metal accumulation. So the biologists and the biomedics said this is because in a diseased brain, the brain cannot handle iron the way it should do normally. And so we're starting to see accumulations of magnetic particles in Alzheimer's brains because of that pathological mishandling of the iron that's present in the brain. Yeah? So these pictures, I will tell you exactly when these were published in a moment. All the fibrous stuff that you see here, these are the fibrils and the accumulations of protein and dead cells that typify a plaque in a human brain with Alzheimer's. And what I've noted here, those little tiny bright spots that are marked by the yellow arrows, they are magnetite crystals. So those magnetic crystals are sitting directly associated with these Alzheimer's plaques. And here's a bit of a close-up. Look at the scale bar. Size matters. Look at the scale bar. So that scale bar is 1 micrometer. So these magnetite particles are nanoparticles. They're down at about 10 or 20 nanometers. So this paper came out in Nature Scientific Reports in 2016. When this paper came out, I was waiting for the editor's decision on a paper I'd submitted about the possibility of magnetite particles in human brains coming from air pollution exposure. That's literally, that was the timing of it. So here's a close-up of some of those magnetite particles in AD plaques. And again, look at the scale bar. You see what I'm saying about the size of these magnetic particles associated with the plaques, around about 10, 20, 30 nanometers in size. I submitted my paper that suggested some brain magnetite was associated with air pollution exposure, and it was a very difficult process getting it published. Because at that stage, everybody believed, all the specialists in brains believed that all brain magnetite formed inside the brain. And what my hypothesis was that actually brains contain varying concentrations of air pollution derived magnetite pollution nanoparticles. This was not popular. So this was the paper we published that came out, I think it was just 2 months after that paper that showed the magnetite particles inside the plaques in human brains. So this was our paper, magnetite pollution nanoparticles in the human brain. So let me show you our results, and you can make your mind up about how and why these magnetic particles are inside the brain. So here's a picture of a human brain. And the first sets of samples that we had were from the frontal lobe of the brain. So these were human samples, and they came from 2 sources. The Manchester Brain Bank in the UK, which actually is brain samples from all over the north of England. And a second set of samples, which came from colleagues in Mexico City, which is much more polluted than the north of England. And the bit of the brain that we were looking at, do you see where it says olfactory bulb? So this is where you breathe in through your nose. The olfactory bulb is a set of nerves that bypass the blood-brain barrier. So information comes through your olfactory bulb and it goes straight into the frontal cortex. There is no blood-brain barrier in that portion of the brain. So we were measuring frontal samples just behind the olfactory bulb. So the first thing we did was we had our brain samples, our brain tissue samples. And the first thing we did was measure how much magnetic material was inside each sample. So this diagram summarizes those data. So on the y-axis, as always, the magnetic content that we measured in the brain is on the y-axis. And the age at death of the sample, the human sample we were looking at, is on the horizontal axis. So the groupings here, the pink colors are the samples that came from people who died in Mexico City. The blue samples are samples from the Manchester Brain Bank from people who had severe Alzheimer's disease. And the green and the purple ones are people with mild or moderate Alzheimer's disease. So what I would say about this diagram is that many of the young samples that we had from Mexico City, when I say young, we'd say less than 40 years at time of death, you can see that their brains are really magnetic. So do you see next to the key, there's a red dot there and it's got 40. That person was 40 years at the time of their death. Look how strongly magnetic that person's brain is. You might say there's a general trend to the older and older people having more and more magnetite, but it's quite variable. It's really quite variable. If we look at the previous paper that I mentioned that only had 6 samples, the concentration of magnetite in the brain, you can see on the right-hand vertical axis, we've converted our magnetic values into the amount of magnetite, micrograms per gram of brain tissue. So you can see our values vary mostly between 0.5 up to about 10 micrograms per gram. So you can see those numbers compare pretty well with the very small data set that was published back in 2014. But the bottom line here is that the amount of magnetite in a person's brain, it's very variable. It's not the same. And even in very young cases from Mexico City, some of those were some of the most magnetic brains we looked at. Okay, so to see these nanoparticles, we have to use electron microscopy. So we use these very high resolution electron microscopes. And so here are some introductory images of the magnetic particles that we saw inside those brain samples. So the scale bar, unfortunately, the image I see is back to front, but the scale bar you can see bottom left back to front is 200 nanometers on the left-hand image. And can you see those spherules? Those very dark black spherules. And on the right-hand side, this is a blood vessel that's coming close to some of the brain tissues. And again, you can see those black, dark, dense, in this case, metal-bearing nanoparticles nestled inside the blood cells in that blood vessel. Now, when we looked at the Mexico samples and the Manchester samples, we found some natural brain magnetite. So that's what the natural brain magnetite looks like. Those very geometric, very crystalline, 50 or so nanometer natural magnetites. So we had to look very hard to find those, but we did see them in many of the samples we looked at. But for every one of the natural magnetic crystals like that, we saw about 100 of the spheral air pollution derived particles. So here on A, you can see, and that's the blown up image of it, a magnetic spheral right inside this person's brain cells. And then on the right-hand side, you can see those beautifully geometric crystalline natural magnetites. But literally, we had to hunt very, very, very hard to find those natural ones, whereas the circular ones, spherical ones, were common as muck. That's a very bad choice of phrase, isn't it? Common as air pollution muck. So here you can see some more reasonably sophisticated analysis. How do I know it's magnetite? We do this spectroscopic analysis, and a big shout out here to Glasgow University. Donald McLaren in physics in Glasgow was one of the big assistants in doing this work. And so we're able to actually spectroscopically identify that these strongly ion-rich particles in the brain, most of them are magnetite. Some of them are slightly oxidized at their surface to maghemite, but actually these very strongly magnetic particles. Okay, it's quite a complicated slide, but I'm sure you've got it in terms of looking at the scale bars, work out the size of these particles. So these images, we're looking at cells now in the brain stem. So the brain stem is at the back of your brain. And again, these bright, dense, the reason they're bright is they're dense particles. You can see those bright particles, and they've broken through the membrane of some of the subcellular structures of the brain cells. And if you look across to the right-hand side, again, we're mapping the elemental composition of those particles. So the orange particles are rich in aluminium. Aluminium shouldn't be in your brain. The red particles are rich in iron. And in this case, the blue-green particles are rich in titanium. So it's not just magnetite particles, it's magnetite plus these other metals. And you remember from the cocktail of air pollution, that's normal. Iron plus chromium plus zinc plus nickel plus titanium. So here's some more of that chemical analysis. And again, you can see our dense metal-rich particles sitting in the brain cells. And here you can see the top of the screen, we've got platinum and nickel. Well, platinum's mostly coming from our catalytic converters. Again, has absolutely no place in a human brain. Nickel, cobalt, you know, these are just things that they have no natural physiological place in a brain. Because there's so many magnetic particles in a human brain, depending on exposure to pollution, we can actually magnetically extract them. So we can take our tissue sample and we can dissolve the organic part of the tissue, and we can have a magnet, a strong magnet, we can pull all the magnetic particles out. So this is what this slide is. So this just begins to give you a flavor of how many of these particles there are in the brain, depending on where that person lived. So there are literally millions, if not billions, of these air pollution-derived nanoparticles in some human brains. So here again are some of the brain magnetic extracts. And again, here's some images showing what they look like in close-up. On the right-hand side, this is quite a rare particle. I've not seen many particles like this in the brain samples we've looked at. But do you remember the little surface crystallites on the air pollution spherules? Because those molten droplets, as they cool, the crystallites form at slightly different rates. So that particle, and again, look at the size, it's about, what, 60 nanometers across. Again, this is typical of a high temperature derived magnetite. So it cannot be forming inside the brain. The brain is not operating at temperatures greater than 100 degrees centigrade. Okay, here's a test for you. Tell me which of these pictures is a brain magnetite, and tell me which is an earth pollution magnetite. Well, you know the top left one is the brain one because I've just described it, yeah. But do you take the point? So the bottom left is brain magnetite. The middle bottom two are Lancaster bus station magnetites. So is the point's clear, isn't it? These things are incredibly similar. The brain magnetites and these air pollution magnetites are incredibly similar. Now, I keep telling you, they're not all spherules. Quite a lot of them are spherules. If we see a spherule, we know it was a high temperature sourced magnetite, but they're not all spherules. And here on the left-hand side, this is one of our particles that we've imaged from breakware. So we actually have, an experimental setup where we test brake pads from different manufacturers to see what particles, how many particles, what size, what toxicity are produced from different brake pads. So the left-hand diagram, left-hand image, that arrowhead, that's a breakware particulate. On the right-hand side, this is a particle, an iron-rich particle that these other colleagues, sorry, not colleagues, these other scientists, that's a different story, that these other people found in amyloid plaques in human brain. I smiled because so there's a group of scientists who, you know, until very recently at least, have continued to say all iron in the brain is formed inside the brain. So that's been an ongoing debate. But anyway, so again, I think you can see just how compellingly similar these particles are. So we published the brain paper in 2016. I think I spent 4 years writing close on 30 proposals to try to get a properly funded project to actually do some more work on this and the links, possible links with neurodegenerative disease. This is science. It wasn't a popular hypothesis. So we struggled. But it has to be said that since then, since 2016, there's been a lot of work done, not just in our lab, but in labs worldwide. In particular, there's some very, very good labs in China following up on this work. What we have found in some of these other labs are exactly the same findings. These iron-rich nanoparticles with their co-associated exotic elements, their platinums, their nickels, etc., aluminium, etc., basically they evade every one of our defenses against air pollution particles. So we have no defense against those nanoparticles. So we have found these particles, as it says here, in the brain, different areas of the brain, in the heart, in the placenta, in red blood cells, in the kidney. Other people have identified them in lung effusions in the plasma of the blood. So let me just show you a summary of those findings. So the first one, that was from our frontal cortex samples. This second one is the brainstem particles. Again, those bright spherules, you can see them here inside the mitochondria, the energy-producing subcellular structures, in this case in the heart. Some very recent work we've just published, actually, just a couple of weeks ago. It wasn't me. One of my colleagues in London made volunteers stand at Whitechapel Road for an hour. It wasn't me. I didn't tell them. So they went and stood at Whitechapel Road for an hour. When they came back in, we looked at their blood cells, their red blood cells, and they had lots of little metal-rich nanoparticles sticking all around their red blood cells. Of course, once those particles have come out of the lung, crossed into the red blood cells, then of course they can go, and they do go, everywhere around the system. These iron-rich spherules, that's from the Chinese group, which is from blood plasma. So they separated blood plasma, and that's particles from those. These are interesting. These particles, they're rather acicular, needle-like particles, very unusual. I hadn't seen particles like that before. And we found these in the gut wall, in the nerves of the gut wall. So there's a lot of titanium dioxide that's added to foods, to toothpaste, to whitening agent in toothpaste. And we found these particles in the nerves of the gut wall, and we found the same sorts of particles in the brain stem. Because, of course, your gut and your brain stem are connected by long nerve systems that talk to each other all the time. And these are particles that we found in the placenta of women based in London. So these particles, they get everywhere, basically. Let's move on. That's a complicated slide. Time is moving on. Okay, I'm sort of repeating myself slightly, but why should we be so concerned about iron-rich pollution particles? Why is iron such a potential problem? So I've mentioned to you, iron is a very common constituent of air pollution particles. In fact, I will go back to that slide just because if you look at the bottom left, this is from this work that this Chinese group have been doing. Can you see that the concentration of iron, the blue box whisker, can you see that that's often the most abundant element in these air pollution particles? So iron is often the most abundant. As I've already said, whilst it's an essential element in the brain, in fact, in all human tissues, but particularly the brain, iron is toxic if it's there in excess or not safely locked up and locked away or not safely regulated. In the case of the brain tissues, iron is always the most abundant element that we see in those particles. And I mentioned before, the reason why iron is so toxic to brains is it catalyzes the formation of these reactive oxygen species. So this is why our iron-rich, and as they turn out, many of them strongly magnetic particles in the human brain potentially carry such risk in terms of brain health. Now, we're getting late, but I just want to hit you with something else. And again, it's this thing about size, particle size. So the horizontal axis on this diagram is showing particle size in micrometers. And the blue curve is showing the mass of particles against particle size. Do you see that? So the heaviest particles in air pollution are the big ones, the ones about 5 micrometers in size, because they've got quite a lot of mass. They're 5 micrograms, so they're quite big, yeah? So they're quite heavy. The number of particles of that size in air pollution is very small. So in other words, in a typical air pollution sample, you don't have many PM2.5 or PM10 size particles, but they contribute most of the mass of the particles. Whereas the particles that are nanoscale, they weigh nothing, but the number of them is enormous. Do you see? Does that make sense? So most air pollution policy at the moment is based on mass concentrations of particles, the mass of particles in a cubic meter of air. Well, that's rubbish, because that's not the stuff that's doing the damage. It's the ultrafine particles, which are most numerous, even though they weigh nothing. They're the ones that we really have to be working on. And when we look at all of our traffic-derived particulate pollution, so whether it's brake wear, whether it's tire wear, whether it's exhaust emissions, the vast majority of traffic-derived particulates are nanoparticles. So at the moment, not even regulated, but they're the ones that our bodies cannot defend ourselves against. Depressing, isn't it? So I've got a few more slides, but I'm just going to flick through a few, but just again, to get it sort of in visualized, if you like. So if we look at the lung, bottom left is an image of lung tissue. And, you get right down into the deepest parts of lung tissue, and you get into those little tiny air sacs called the alveoli. So can you see on the right-hand side, there's a picture across one of these air sacs in the lungs. What's the diameter of an air sac in the lung? It's about 20 microns, isn't it? How big are the particles that we're talking about? They're 100 or 1,000 times smaller. So you see, we've absolutely no way of defending ourselves from these particles. Here's again, size matters. Here's a picture of a cell, any cell. It could be a heart cell, for example. And here we have the mitochondria. Those are those substructures that generate the energy that drives the cell's activity. And again, the particles we're looking at, they're less than 100 nanometers in size. So all those particles get right inside even the subcellular structures, right inside the mitochondria, where they can cause damage to the function of those cells. Right. So at this stage, it remains a hypothesis. But I think you'd agree, if you have billions of iron-rich nanoparticles in the brain, it's unlikely that they're just sitting there doing nothing. Would you agree? So it's been known for a long time that the plaques and tangles that are typical of Alzheimer's brain tissue are sites of metal accumulation. And it's entirely feasible, it seems to me, that those metals that are accumulating are not just coming from inside the brain. In fact, how can you have metals like platinum and titanium? They are not present naturally in the brain. When we look at our metal-bearing particles in our brain tissue samples, what's more is we find them associated directly with evidence of damage to the brain. So we see them, and this is where it gets really depressing, even in cases, human cases, whose age is less than 10 years in age. So what follows from that hypothesis is that Alzheimer's disease, you might see it most manifested, most obvious in later life, but it probably starts in childhood or even as a fetus in the womb because of the exposure to those metal particles. I'm going to finish just now, but thinking about that chronology, we published our brains paper in 2016. In 2017, this paper came out in the Lancet. So this was one of those large population studies, a statistical study of associations living near major roads and the incidence of dementia, Parkinson's disease, and multiple sclerosis. And what this large population study found was that for people who lived within 50 meters from a major road, somewhere between 7 to 11% of dementia cases were attributable to living near to the road. Similar work's now being done in America using the Medicaid populations. So again, vast numbers of people being included in those analyses. And again, you can see even moderate amounts of exposure are strongly linked with incidence of these neurodegenerative diseases. Okay, we're nearly there. You might say, well, if you're living near a major road, it's not just particles that you're exposed to. You're exposed to noise. You're exposed to the gases, the nitrous oxide. So how do you know it's the particles that are causing the problem? So we were involved in this study where we had experimental animals. We had mice that were in cages next to one of the busiest roads in Santiago in Chile. And we had the experimental animals who just breathed in the roadside air, and we had control animals that were fed the same, lived in the same place, had the same noise, and they were protected by a HEPA filter. So the air that they were breathing was first treated by going through a HEPA filter. So those animals, those controls, developed no neurodegenerative symptoms in the experiment, whereas our experimental animals all developed neurodegeneration. The control animals weren't exposed to particles, but they were exposed to gases. The HEPA filter didn't take out the gases. It just took out the particles. So this is, again, strong information that suggests it's the particles that are the really important and damaging component of the pollution. Okay, so wrap it all up. We've identified in human brains very abundant, tiny magnetite particles, and they look compellingly similar to the magnetite particles which are just common as muck, as I said before, in traffic and in industry-derived particulate matter. Until that work, all brain magnetite was previously thought to be of biogenic in situ origin. Because magnetite is toxic to brain cells, that exposure to that extra iron, the iron 2+ bearing iron, might be a risk factor for neurodegenerative disease, including Alzheimer's disease. So the hypothesis that we've put forward is that iron, co-associated metal-rich evolution nanoparticles, that they comprise a plausible and, what's more, pervasive risk factor for neurodegenerative disease. Now, of course, we can take that information and we could start to do some new studies. We could say, well, who is going to be exposed a lot to traffic-derived pollution? Shouldn't they have higher rates of neurodegenerative disease? Wouldn't that be sensible to look at? It's actually very hard to get occupational data for Alzheimer's cohorts. Anybody got an indoor fire? Wood burning stove, a coal fire. Very rich source of iron-rich nanoparticles. So you might leave this venue tonight feeling very depressed. But actually, what I always say, knowledge is power. So if you've got a wood-burning stove or a coal fire, don't light it very often. Make sure you've got the windows open. Disperse the stuff, but of course, then you're poisoning everybody outside the house. But if you've got a commute that takes you through some of the busiest city streets every day, change your commute, go a different route. If you've got young children, don't expose them, to all of these traffic-derived pollution particles. When we look at our leaf magnetism, even if you're 2 meters away from the roadside, you get half the dose than if you're at the curbside. If you're walking in town, walk on the downhill side of the street, because the uphill side, the engines are working harder and pumping out more pollution. Knowledge is power. Once you think that this is an entirely plausible cost, an entirely plausible reason for extra incidence of brain disease, do everything in your power to reduce your exposure to it, and write to the government and say, introduce better policies to actually reduce the amount of pollution everybody's exposed to. Electric vehicles are good. They don't produce much breakwater. They have no exhaust particulates, and I don't have shares in Tesla.
Thank you very much. Maggie, Eileen? Right, pretty good. Did you pass it? Yeah. Okay, thank you for that wonderful talk. I can see this person there with a question, hand up. Please remember, when you get the microphone, to hold it like a pop star, straight horizontal in front of your mouth so that everyone can hear you. Just behind you, please.
Thank you very much. Absolutely brilliant talk. To set it in a Scottish context, next year we'll see our next Cleaner Air for Scotland strategy. So we have different legislation. We are covered by Westminster legislation, but we have tighter legislation in Scotland. The World Health Organization brought out guidelines in 2021 for what we should be aiming for, our objectives, annual mean concentrations of the PM2.5s. I'm now scared by what you're saying about all the nanoparticles. So the WHO recommends a level of 5. And in Scotland, our limit is still 10 at the moment. But that legislation next year is an opportunity to bring it down. Absolutely. But like you say, the number of monitors is quite limited. So like for Glasgow City, and there is really good news about how much our air quality has improved. Really it has improved a great deal. But whilst we've got 131 sites monitoring nitrogen dioxide levels across Glasgow City, because you can have diffusion tubes that do it very cheaply, we've only got, I think, 10 or 11 monitoring PM2.5. So like I live within North Kelvin Community Council area, no PM2.5 monitors. And yet I can see people with wood stores outside their flats. And I've now got a wee monitor just inside the window of my flat, and I can see these PM2.5 spikes. And yeah, I'm a paediatrician, so organizations like Mums for Lungs are really encouraging us as health professionals to campaign to raise that awareness. But what should we be asking for in terms of the monitoring? I know what we should be asking for in terms of the limits, but in terms of the monitoring. because we can't all look at the leaves.
No, no. So I think there is better news in terms of policy. So I think the ultrafine particles, the nanoparticles, whichever term you want to use, I think people have got that now. The EU has got it. So there actually are going to be limits introduced for ultrafine particles, nanoparticles. The air pollution community tends to call them UFPs, ultrafine particles. So that's good. So the health impacts of ultrafine particles are increasingly recognized. The neurodegenerative effects at all ages, right across the piece, especially, you know, young primary age school children, they're most vulnerable, so vulnerable to this type of pollution. In terms of monitoring, I think everybody needs to write to the representative, the most near representative, and say, you know, it needs to be done. The monitoring needs to be done. Because do you remember the Lancaster leaf map? It's so spatially variable. So we had another study in Lancaster where we had primary age school children wearing monitors on their backpacks. And they took their normal routes to school, and we were able to map what their exposure was, you know, twice a day, 5 days a week, 30 weeks a year. And for some of them, the exposure levels were through the roof. And so we just said to the parents, well, if they took this route, in fact, their exposure would be 25% of what it is currently. I mean, literally, you know, that's the difference you can make to somebody of that developmental stage. So the monitoring, I mean, there are cheap monitors now compared to the sort of gold standard monitors. So if you're, you know, part of a school association, part of a community, you know, write to your representative and ask for some monitoring to be carried out in your area. Because without the data, you're guessing, aren't you? You can't see it. So you have to measure it. And PM 2.5, unfortunately, it's quite helpful, but there isn't a total, you know, one-for-one correlation between PM 2.5 and ultrafine particles. It's better than nothing. It's a good start to measure PM 2.5. But in an ideal world, we'd be measuring ultrafine particles, nanoparticles as well.
Hi. Have you factored in aviation travel for tech particles?
What was that? Sorry?
Aviation.
Aviation travel.
Yeah.
Do you mean people on planes or people on the flight path of planes, or both?
Both.
Right. So there is a growing debate about aerotoxic syndrome, which is condition, you know, illness experienced, especially by cabin crew and pilots, but obviously also by passengers. So there are occasions when the cabin is flooded with exposure from engine exhausts, including the particles. So that's one part of the problem. And then on the flight path, yes, again, there have been statistical associations, strong associations found between certain illnesses and being on the flight path of airlines as well. So yeah, that's important. It's not as important for most people, but it is important clearly for some people.
Thanks a lot for the interesting lecture and some of the really beautiful electron microscopy images. I'm wanting to ask in particular about those images where you've got co-location of your reactive nanoparticles in your amyloid plaques in the brain tissue samples. I can certainly imagine a scenario where the reactive nanoparticles are nucleating the growth of those plaques. But from a chicken and egg scenario, I can also imagine a scenario where the plaques are acting as pre-concentrators for the nanoparticles. Do you have any evidence to suggest that one or the other, or perhaps both, are dominating in this particular case?
Nope, there's no evidence whatsoever because the studies have yet to be carried out. And it gets worse. So I've had somebody say to me, so if your hypothesis is true, then the older somebody is and the worse their Alzheimer's, then the more particles there'll be in the brain. So you'll see a strong increase in the magnetic content of a brain for an older person, especially if they've got Alzheimer's disease. It's just not that simple. So some of the particles in the brain, likely the brain is trying to dissolve and remove from the brain. And we have absolutely no idea. The clearance rates in the brain, we know, are slow compared to other organs, but we have no idea whether it's a good thing or a bad thing if you try to dissolve the particles in your brain. Because if you try to dissolve them, then perhaps you've actually got, very reactive ion available to do more damage. So none of this is known. This is a whole new field that if there's sufficient evidence that suggests this could be an important factor, then there needs to be a seriously funded research to follow up on it. Actually, I've said there isn't any work being done, but some of the Chinese groups are now beginning to do that work. It's a really good question, and I don't have any data to say either way. So designing the experiments that demonstrate causality, the causal effect of these particles, that's the next critical step. And of course, the way that most scientists suggest doing that is by animal experimentation, which personally I don't either do or want to do.
Thank you. So if somebody has a blood test which has a very high iron reading, is that quite a different measure than iron particles?
It is. Yeah, it is. So iron, we know it's essential and it's abundant in the human body. So hemoglobin, is a major source of iron in the body, or a major component of iron in the body. But the hemoglobin is not ferromagnetic, not this strongly magnetic material. So the work that's been done on these air pollution particles has been done based on magnetic concentration of the particles, either from the plasma, the blood plasma in the Chinese study, or in our recent case, we've actually imaged the red blood cells themselves. And these particles, these metal-rich particles, are sticking right around the membrane of the red blood cells. And I remember a colleague of mine at a geophysics conference, he said he'd measured his blood sample and it was paramagnetic, which is very weakly magnetic. So I said, well, that's because you're anemic, which wasn't true at all. So those are totally different forms of iron in the body.
Very much. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Is the magnetism of these particles playing any part in what we're talking about here? The fact that they're magnetic?
So these questions are just first rate. So it's entirely possible, because you've got these ferromagnetic particles, they will respond to an external magnetic field. And so most magnetic fields that we're exposed to are really, really low. But these are strongly magnetic particles. So it's entirely, I was just discussing this with Pat before the lecture, actually. Some people do say that they have electromagnetic sensitivity. They say they can detect magnetic storms, or sometimes they feel unwell, but they feel they are sensitive to magnetic fields. And we know, you saw the video of the magnetotactic bacteria. We know that organisms can respond to the Earth's magnetic field. And we've got people who in various brains, hearts, kidney, joints, have got more magnetic particles than they should have ever had, from exposure to these air pollution sources. So again, it's sort of like Occam's razor, isn't it? How could those ferromagnetic particles not be responding to magnetic fields? And the whole thing about electromagnetic sensitivity, it's been one of those really dodgy scientific areas, because the experiments that have been done are generally quite poorly designed. The results are a bit iffy. But actually, just maybe some of the iffy results represent the fact that you've actually got some people who are full of magnetic nanoparticles, and other people who aren't as exposed are not. So you can see the number of different new hypotheses that can be formulated, and really it would be terrifically interesting to start following some of these up. So a colleague of mine has done some measurements in cell cultures, and they apply small artificial magnetic fields akin to the size of the magnetic field you might get from a hairdryer or from a mobile phone next to your brain. And they actually do record some movement within the cells as a response to those stray magnetic fields. So it's again, it's opening up a whole new ballpark there. Question very back.
Hi there, my name's James. My concern is about a different type of pollution, as I gave up smoking years ago and vaping last year, but I find I'm still getting affected with the toxins for cigarette smoke and the vapes, and they're breathing that out into the pavement, and it's all going in the cities. With the front of buildings, when it's out and inside like restaurants and stuff like that, they should be at the back of the buildings, if you get what I'm saying. So I was wondering what your thoughts are about that.
So I like this question because somebody said to me again, well, you know, if your magnetic particles are important, surely there'd be more data, there'd be more evidence. Do you know, it took 50 years to prove that smoking cigarettes caused lung cancer. I don't know how many beagles, you know, 50 years to actually prove it. So you're dead right. You know, if anyone's smoking, well, you don't have to worry about traffic-derived pollution because you've got your own source, you know, that you're exposed to, and of course anyone near you is exposed to as well. So, you know, we come back to the smoking, the vaping. Vaping's no real improvement. You know, the open fires. You know, we'll look back, I think, in 10 years and say, my goodness me, you know, we were just poisoning ourselves.
It may be a follow-up on a question before, but you've talked mainly about iron and magnetic particles, but these seem to correlate with the presence of other metals like copper and so on. Could it be these non-magnetic particles that are causing much of the trouble?
It could. It could. So things like copper, aluminium, chromium, nickel, lead, they are co-associated. But it could be all of those, any of those together. The thing about the iron is it's abundant. So so copper might be slightly more redox active than iron, but it's often present in less amounts than the iron. So, you know, it's sort of like an abundance multiplied by toxicity calculation. But it doesn't have to just be the iron. But the thing about the magnetic particles is they're so distinctive, and because we can measure the magnetism of the tissues, we can tell you how many particles are in there.
Another at the very top at the back.
Yes, going back in time, a lot of us would have grown up in Glasgow. You mentioned coal. Now, there was times in November when a week would go and you could hardly see your hand. It was that density of smoke. Now, two things. I'm just wondering if, was there evidence of Alzheimer's? Because you were saying in your talk that coal was as bad as pollution. And secondly, you know, if it wasn't, you know, maybe you've investigated pickled brains or something to see if it did exist in those days, but it's been going on since the Industrial Revolution, maybe?
So one thing about pollution, a lot of us see pictures, for instance, in India, there was the Diwali, wasn't there? So all the fireworks, a lot of pollution. And you can see it, you can see the fog in the atmosphere. If you can see particles hanging about in the atmosphere, it means they're quite big. So there might be a lot of them, but actually they're possibly not as damaging as the really small particles that you don't see. The coal is interesting because I think we should be looking at when most people stopped using coal and started having central heating in their houses. So actually we did a little study in Ireland where there's still a lot of peat burning. We found a relationship between decline in cognitive performance and if you'd had a peat fire in your home, either as a child or as an adult or still going on. There was something else I was going to say about coal.
Let's take another question. I think it's in the middle.
If you have a patient with a high concentration of magnetic particles in the brain, and you expose this patient or these particles, now not to weak magnetic fields, but to very strong magnetic fields of several Teslas. I'm thinking like of magnetic resonance imaging. Could that basically then cause local damage to the tissue if these particles are exposed to very strong magnetic fields, like in magnetic resonance imaging?
I'm sorry, I haven't quite got your question. Would you just...
Yeah, you talked about sort of evidence of sort of exposure to small magnetic fields, but what happens if you have very strong magnetic fields, several Tesla, like in magnetic resonance imaging?
Okay. Yeah.
You have a high concentration of magnetic particles.
Sure.
Could that then cause local damage to the tissue?
So if you had an MRI scan,
Yeah, for example, yes, several Tesla.
for example,
Yeah.
Yeah, really, again, fantastic question. So I've talked to some of the people who do the MRI scanning, and I've said that sort of thing. You know, if you've got lots of magnetite, surely you'd see it on the MRI scan. And several of them told me the software that they use to process the MRI images it specifically excludes if you have big magnetic fields in local areas, so that it sees just the water-based differences in paramagnetic signal. So there's potentially a seam of information there that isn't being used. So it's a really good question. That again, somebody might usefully follow up on.
I have time for just two last questions.
As I'll try to be a bit more, get a bit more optimism at the end because I'm quite depressed. You mentioned about your mice in Mexico City in your control group, and there was an air filter. Is that sort of thing that is only available to a scientist or general public? Can we get them?
It's a fantastic point. Let's finish on an upbeat note. So you can get an air filter, a cheap air conditioning small device. If you have an open fire, you should get one. And they have HEPA filters in them. So absolutely, you can easily buy. They're not very expensive either, and they run very cheaply. So you can actually put HEPA filters inside an air filter inside your own house. And there's something else. In fact, there's two other things. So the study we just did on the red blood cells on the volunteers in Whitechapel, after we poisoned them the first time, we sent them out again, this time wearing an FFP2 mask, which you can Google it, a mask. And it did the job. The people who were wearing masks didn't have nearly so many particles in their bloodstream. So, okay, we don't all want to be walking around in masks all the time, but actually they do a job. And third thing, I can remember the third thing on this occasion, the third thing, the leaf magnetism. So I haven't had time to talk to you about this. We realized when we were measuring our roadside leaves that some types of trees, some leaf types, the sticky ones, the irregular ones, the lots of tiny small ones, did a fantastic job of taking the particles out of the air. So we've actually been doing work planting, I call them trees grown as hedges, because you don't want them huge because then they trap the air pollution in the street. Trees, we've planted trees outside some primary schools in Manchester, and it reduces the pollution significantly inside the playgrounds. So know your enemy. Once you know your enemy, you can do something about him.
Brilliant note to finish on. I think I'll invite the President Pat to give the vote of thanks.
Well, my name's Pat Monaghan. I'm the Society President, as you can tell from this large piece of metal that I'm keeping away from
Magnetic.
my brain. So Barbara has given us a wonderful talk, obviously, generated lots of questions, full of information, telling us about magnetic particles in the natural environment, in some species like birds. I was surprised by the bacteria. I don't know where they've got to go, really. Interesting differences potentially between men and women. My husband's always telling me how good he is at navigating compared with me. I can now say that's because your head's full of iron. But also, Barbara's told us about difficulties in getting funding for new ideas, but also how a new idea can spark off an enormous field of research. There's been lots of ideas for new research, even in this talk. So hopefully much of this work will be funded. So it's my pleasure to present Barbara with, if I can get it open, the Society's Kelvin Medal. I'm sure Lord Kelvin would have been delighted by your talk, but of course he might also have been exposed to quite a lot of air pollution. And we know that this burning of fossil fuels is doing great environmental damage, not just to our atmosphere, to our climate, but also to our brains, it appears. So I don't want to end on an unpleasant note, but I can't think of anything particularly cheerful to end on. So two things I will present Barbara with that's cheerful. The Kelvin Medal on behalf of the Society.
Very nice.
And importantly, the Society paperweight, which is not within the Society. Very nice.
Thank you.